Hey, 8th grade, welcome to your flip lesson on friction. This information can help get started on your lab for the week. This is the first part of lesson 2 of chapter 2. The second part is all about gravity, and we'll get to talk about that a little later. So our objectives for this video are, there we go. We're going to spend some time defining friction and the factors that affect friction. And then we're going to identify 4 different types of friction and maybe just refer to our free body diagrams again. We talked about friction today in class when we were trying to identify all the net force of objects in motion or not in motion. So objects that have balanced and unbalanced forces. And anytime we had an object in motion and we drew our free body diagram, we also had to identify the force that acts in opposition to that motion, which is friction. So I'm going to caution you, my slides are a little backwards, and so I might have to skip one and come back. So be patient with me. There we go. So the definition. So friction is the force that acts opposite the direction of an object, of the motion of an object. So if an object is in motion, the opposite force to that is friction. So the applied force maybe pushes that object or pulls that object and causes it to move. When that object is moving, the force that opposes that motion is called friction. And here we have one of the free body diagrams we were working on today. This would be the force is, wow, I didn't know my computer did that. So this would be an applied force to the right, and then the frictional force would be to the left. Without friction, that might be fun to do, but without friction, this object would continue to move in the same direction until it struck another object. And it's important to note that friction, and we'll talk about this when we talk about air resistance, but friction is not just between like your hand and the table or your foot and the floor or the car and the road, but also there's air friction, which is called air resistance. So objects moving through the air also come into contact with friction that kind of slows their motion and causes it to stop. So the force of friction is the force that acts the direction opposite the motion of the object, and without friction that object will continue to move in the same direction until it strikes another object. So if I'm like rolling a ball to the back of the room, it's going to continue to roll if there were no friction until it hit something. So let's go back and talk about some factors that affect friction. So first and foremost, the types of surfaces that are involved between the objects that are touching affect the friction. So if friction is the force that is between objects that are touching, then what the surfaces are does make a difference. So tomorrow you're going to be working with building some ramps and doing some things with different grades of sandpaper, and you're going to be designing an experiment that will determine how the type of surface affects the friction or the motion of an object. I mean, this is pretty intuitive. So rough sandpaper versus maybe smooth wax paper, how is that going to affect the motion of an object? You could make some hypotheses just based on what you already know. Those of you that ski, I'm a terrible skier, but those of you that ski, you might wax your skis. What's the reason why you would wax your skis? I would guess, I don't know, maybe I would guess that you'd want it to go faster because the wax creates less friction between your ski and the snow. For me, I'd want to scrape them because I would need more friction, but if you are a skier, you are definitely, you sort of have this intuitive sense of how friction affects your motion. Right now, my car's in the shop getting an oil change. And well, that has to do with friction too, because we have to put oil in our car because it keeps all of the moving parts lubricated. It decreases the friction between all of the parts of the car that are moving in the engine. Without that oil, you would just have the metal scraping on the metal, and that would cause the engine to overheat. So the friction, the oil reduces the friction in car parts. And so maybe take some time to think about a few examples we'll talk about in class tomorrow. The second thing you're going to be testing in class tomorrow is not only the types of surfaces involved, but how hard the surfaces are being pushed together. And you can also think about that as how much force is pushing the surfaces together. So if you're testing, maybe tomorrow you'll test the the friction between a pair of running shoes versus basketball shoes, or maybe aluminum wheels on a car versus rubber wheels on a car. How much the car, like how much mass or how much the car is pushing down against the road, or your sneaker is pushing down against the floor, affects the amount of friction. Okay, so the factors that affect friction, the factors that affect friction are the types of surfaces involved, and also how hard the surface is being pushed together, or how much force is pushing the surfaces together. That's really funny. Factors that affect friction. Next, there are different types of friction. And you'll be able to experiment with some of these tomorrow. Static friction. Well, static friction is basically the friction that is between objects that are not moving. So static friction is the reason why you can put like your book on the desk and it doesn't just fly across the desk. Your book is not moving, but its contact with the table is called static friction. So objects that are moving or not moving, if an object is in contact with another object, then friction is a factor. And so static friction is between objects that are not in motion. Rolling friction, well, this is when one object is rolling across another. And we will actually bring up examples and talk about examples of things like snow tires or studded tires versus non-studded tires. This is rolling friction as your tires are rolling across the road. And in the winter, you might hear that your parents are thinking about putting studded tires on their car, or snow tires, and these have deeper treads and even like little, little kind of studs on the outside that help them grip the ground, and they can move more easily, increases the friction, allows them to move more easily through snow. Fluid friction. Fluid friction is when a solid moves through a liquid, and this liquid can be water or air. So whenever a solid moves through a liquid, this would be a swimmer through the water. That would be fluid friction, the swimmer's hand moving through the water. Also, a skydiver moving through the air would also be considered fluid friction. And finally, we have sliding friction. This is the one you're going to be working with tomorrow, actually sliding and rolling. This is when one object slides over another object. And so when you're going to be maybe dragging your sneakers or moving something across the desk tomorrow, this is sliding friction. One object is sliding over the other, and kind of that sliding causes the object to slow down.